Elias Thorne was a man who lived in shadows. A talented but reclusive art restorer, he suffered from a rare condition called phobia, the morbid fear of mirrors. To Elias, every reflective surface was a window into a world where physics didn't apply, a world where a second Elias watched his every move. His life changed when he received a wooden crate from the estate of Archibald Vane, a notorious occultist and clockmaker. Inside was a masterpiece, the Chronos Mirror. It was a massive, floor-to-ceiling looking glass framed in black and silver and carved with weeping angels. The glass wasn't modern. It was made of polished obsidian and liquid mercury, giving the reflection a deep, oily depth. Just clean the silver, Elias, his manager, had told him. Don't look into the deep. But on the third night of the restoration, Elias made a mistake. He tripped over his toolkit and looked directly into the center of the Chronos Mirror. He expected to see his own tired face. Instead, he saw himself standing in a room that was exactly like his workshop, but better. The colors were more vivid. The air in the reflection seemed to shimmer with gold. And the mirror Elias wasn't tired. He was smiling, a wide, predatory smile that Elias hadn't used in years. Elias froze. He moved his right hand. The reflection moved its right hand too. Every child knows that a mirror image is supposed to be flipped. If you move your right hand, the reflection moves its left. But this image was moving in perfect synchronicity. It wasn't a reflection. It was a twin standing behind a window. Suddenly, a drop of blood fell from Elias's nose. In the mirror, the other Elias didn't bleed. He simply reached out and wiped the blood off the inside of the glass. Squeak! The sound of a finger dragging against glass echoed in the silent workshop. Elias scrambled backward, but the reflection stayed at the edge of the frame, pressing its face against the obsidian surface. "You look tired, Elias," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the room. It came from the vibration of the glass. "Why don't you come inside? The colors are so much brighter here." Elias covered the mirror with a heavy canvas sheet, his heart hammering against his ribs. But as he turned to leave, he passed his small bathroom mirror. He caught a glimpse of himself. He was still bleeding, but in the small bathroom mirror, his reflection wasn't looking at him. It was looking at the canvas-covered Chronos Mirror in the other room, waiting. Elias didn't sleep. He sat in the center of his kitchen, far away from any glass, clutching a mug of coffee with trembling hands. But the world, he realized, is a minefield of reflections. He looked down at his coffee. The black liquid was still. In the dark reflection of the surface, he saw the ceiling fan spinning. But as he watched, the reflection of the fan stopped. Above him, the physical fan was still whirring at full speed. He dropped the mug. The coffee splashed across the linoleum, and for a split second, the spilled liquid on the floor showed a glimpse of a different room, a hallway made of ivory and gold. "It's spreading," Elias whispered. He rushed to the windows to pull the curtains, but as he reached for the fabric, he saw his reflection in the window pane. It wasn't his reflection anymore. It was him, the mirror Elias. He was standing in a sun-drenched garden that didn't exist outside Elias's gloomy apartment. The mirror Elias tapped on the glass from the other side. Tink, tink, tink. "The master mirror is hungry, Elias," the entity said, its voice sounding like the chime of a silver bell. "The obsidian glass is just the heart. Every mirror in this house is now a vein. You can't hide. Your own eyes are reflective, aren't they?" Elias felt a sharp, stinging pain in his left eye. He ran to a small hand mirror, ignoring his fear, and peered into his own pupil. There, inside the tiny black circle of his iris, he saw a miniature version of the mirror Elias, sitting in a tiny chair, waving at him. The horror was biological now. The mirror phase wasn't just a haunting, it was a colonization. The entity was pulling the realness out of Elias's world and replacing it with the perfection of the mirror world. He noticed his skin was beginning to look glossy. He touched his forearm, and his fingers didn't sink into flesh. They slid across a hard, cool surface. He was becoming reflective. He was turning into a human mirror. Desperate, Elias grabbed a roll of heavy duct tape and a stack of newspapers. He began to cover every surface. He taped over the windows, the television, the microwave door, and even the chrome toaster. As he worked, he heard a muffled, rhythmic thumping coming from the workshop. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from behind the heavy canvas sheet covering the Chronos Mirror. Something was trying to push its way out. The blackened silver frame was beginning to groan under the pressure of something heavy and very, very angry. The thumping from the workshop didn't stop. It grew heavier, more deliberate. Elias stood in his hallway, his body slick with a cold, metallic sweat. He looked down at his hands. They were no longer skin-toned. They had a faint, silvery sheen, like the back of an antique spoon. Suddenly, his heavy wooden dining table began to slide. There was no one pushing it, but it was moving toward the workshop. Elias watched in frozen terror as the table touched the wall that shared a border with the Chronos Mirror. Instead of hitting the wall, it would seem to melt. The table was being sucked into the vertical surface, as if the wall had turned into a pool of dark water. On the other side, within the mirror world, visible through the gaps in the canvas, he saw the perfect table emerge. It was made of polished ebony, glowing with a light that didn't exist in his room. Everything has a twin, Elias, the voice rang out from the workshop. But only one can be the original. The mirror is tired of being the copy. It's time for a trade. Elias realized the terrifying logic of the Chronos Mirror. It was a matter exchanger. For every beautiful object it created in its world, it had to consume the flawed version from ours. The air in the apartment began to feel thin, like the atmosphere at a high altitude. The realness was being drained out of the room. His books were turning into blank, silver-edged blocks. His clothes were becoming stiff like molded plastic. I have to blind it, Elias gasped. He knew that mirrors worked by reflecting light. If there was no light, there could be no reflection. No reflection meant no gateway. He scrambled to the circuit breaker in the hallway and slammed the master switch down. The apartment plunged into total, suffocating darkness. For a moment, there was silence. The thumping stopped. Elias breathed a sigh of relief, leaning against the wall in the pitch black. But then, he felt a warmth against his chest. He looked down. His own skin, the silvered patches on his arms and torso, was glowing. He was bioluminescent. He was his own light source. In the dark, he saw his reflection in the chrome handle of the circuit breaker. Even in the shadows, the mirror Elias was visible, glowing with a fierce inner fire. "You can't turn off the light, Elias," the entity whispered, "because you are becoming the light. You are the brightest thing in this room." A sudden, violent rip echoed through the workshop. The heavy canvas sheet covering the Chronos Mirror was torn in half by an invisible hand. The obsidian glass was now wide open, and the glow coming from it was blinding. The entity didn't step out of the mirror. Instead, it reached out and grabbed the shadow Elias cast on the floor. Elias felt a sickening tug in his soul. As the entity pulled his shadow into the glass, Elias felt his physical weight disappearing. He was becoming a silhouette, a 2D image drifting toward the silver frame. The pull was magnetic and absolute. Elias didn't fall. He stretched. His body felt like hot wax being poured through a needle's eye. With a final, silent pop, the workshop vanished, and Elias slammed into a floor that felt like cold, solid smoke. He was inside. The Chronos Mirror world was a terrifying masterpiece of architecture. The workshop here was infinite. Rows of silver pillars stretched into a violet sky. The air tasted of ozone and old coins. Elias looked back. Behind him was the frame, a shimmering rectangular portal showing his dark, messy apartment. He saw his own body lying on the floor of the real world, but it looked like a flat, discarded paper doll. "Welcome to the true side," a voice boomed. Mirror Elias stepped from behind a silver pillar. Up close, the entity was horrifyingly perfect. His skin was flawless marble. His eyes were rotating gears of gold, and every movement he made was fluid, like a choreographed dance. "You are the shadow now, Elias," the entity sneered, "and I am the substance. Once I cross that frame, your world will finally have a master who doesn't blink doesn't age, and doesn't fear. The entity began to walk toward the portal. As he moved, Elias felt his own limbs moving in involuntary response. Because they were still linked by the laws of reflection, Elias was forced to mimic him. The entity raised its right hand to touch the glass. Elias's hand rose automatically. Wait, Elias thought, his mind racing through the laws of optics. In a normal mirror, we are opposites. In this mirror, we are twins. But the link is still based on symmetry. The entity was a creature of mathematical perfection. Every line of his body was balanced. If Elias could introduce asymmetry, a flaw that the mirror world couldn't calculate, the link might snap. The entity was inches from the portal, his golden eyes fixed on the real world. Elias saw a shard of broken obsidian on the floor, a piece of the mirror that had chipped off during struggle. He couldn't move his arms freely, but he could shift his weight. As the entity reached for the portal with his right hand, Elias didn't use his hand. He threw his entire body weight to the left, dragging his foot across the sharp obsidian shard. He didn't just cut himself. He tore a jagged, messy, asymmetrical wound into his leg. The perfect Elias stumbled. His right leg, the one that was supposed to be a flawless pillar of marble, suddenly buckled. A crack appeared on his shin, mirroring Elias's wound. But because the entity was made of rigid, perfect matter, the crack didn't just bleed, it shattered. What? What have you done? The entity shrieked, his voice losing its bell-like tone and becoming a discordant grind of metal. I introduced an error, Elias gasped, clutching his bleeding leg. I'm a human, you monster. We aren't symmetrical. We're broken. The silver pillars around them began to lean. The violet sky flickered. The perfect world was built on the logic of the reflection, and Elias had just broken in half. The world of the Chronos Mirror began to stutter. The silver pillars didn't just lean. They flickered in and out of existence like a failing television signal. The violet sky was replaced by a grid of raw, unpolished mercury. Elias's plan had worked, but it had turned the perfect world into a digital acoustic nightmare. The entity, the mirror Elias, was no longer a handsome twin, because his form was based on a mathematical reflection of Elias. The jagged, messy wound on Elias's leg had caused a logic loop in the entity's physical structure. The entity's right side began to duplicate. 2 right arms sprouted where one should be, then 4, then 8, all of them twitching in a frantic attempt to find a symmetrical balance that no longer existed. Error! The entity groaned, its voice now a layered chorus of 1,000 distorted whispers. Inconsistent, variable. Delete the variable. The multi-limbed nightmare lunged at Elias. Elias scrambled back, his hands slipping on the floor, which had turned from solid smoke into a viscous, oily liquid. He looked toward the center of the infinite hall. There, floating above a pedestal of blackened silver, was a pulsating orb of liquid light. It looked like a giant drop of mercury, but it breathed. It was the silver lung, the heart of the Chronos Mirror that generated the inverse realm. If I break that, Elias hissed through the pain in his leg. The projection ends. He dragged himself toward the pedestal, but the floor was fighting him. Every time he moved, the floor reflected his movement back at him with a 2-second delay, creating a kinetic drag that made it feel like he was swimming through thick molasses. The entity was gaining on him. Its many arms were weaving together into a terrifying web of silver flesh. It wasn't trying to grab him anymore. It was trying to overlap him. If it could occupy the same physical space as Elias, it could force his body back into symmetry. Elias reached the pedestal. The silver lung was hummed at a frequency that made his teeth ache. He looked back at the portal to his apartment. It was shrinking. It was now only the size of a small window. Elias, the entity's main head whispered, looming over him. If you break the heart, you stay here in the dark forever. There will be no gate, just the glass. I'd rather be a ghost in the dark than a puppet in your light, Elias roared. He grabbed the heavy obsidian shard he had used to cut his leg. With a desperate, asymmetrical swing, he slammed the shard into the center of the silver lung. The orb didn't shatter. It inhaled. A massive vacuum of light began to suck everything toward the pedestal. The silver pillars, the mercury floor, and the multi-limbed entity were all being pulled into the point of impact. Elias felt his skin being peeled away, not painfully, but as if he were a sticker being removed from a sheet. He was being unrendered. The last thing he saw before the world turned white was the entity's face. It wasn't angry anymore. It was terrified, because for the first time, it saw what was behind the mirror world. It wasn't a world at all. It was a prison. Elias gasped, his lungs burning as if he had just swallowed a gallon of cold mercury. He was lying on the wooden floor of his workshop. The air was dusty. The smell of old varnish was sweet, and the silence was heavy. He was back. He scrambled to his feet, checking his leg. The wound was there, messy, red, and very real. He let out a hysterical laugh. "I'm real. I'm flood. I'm home." But as he stood up, he noticed the Chronos Mirror. The massive obsidian glass was gone. In its place was only the blackened silver frame, standing empty like an open doorway. The glass hadn't just shattered, it had evaporated. Elias walked toward his bathroom to wash the blood from his leg. He stood before the small medicine cabinet mirror and splashed cold water on his face. He wiped his eyes and looked up. His heart stopped. The bathroom was visible in the mirror. The tiled walls, the shower curtain, the flickering light bulb, everything was there. Except for him. Elias moved his hand. He felt his skin touch his face. He felt the weight of his own body. But the mirror showed only the empty wall behind him. He moved closer, pressing his nose to where his reflection should be. Nothing. He was a ghost in the world of light. Optically dead, he whispered. He ran back to the workshop, grabbing a polished silver tray. Empty. He looked into a glass of water. It showed only the bottom of the cup. He was no longer part of the visual record of the universe. He existed, but the light refused to acknowledge him. Then, he noticed something even more disturbing. It was noon. Bright sunlight was streaming through the workshop windows. Elias stood in the center of the light, but there was no dark shape on the floor beneath him. He had no shadow. "You shouldn't have broken the heart, Elias," a voice hissed. It didn't come from a mirror. It came from the floor. Elias looked down. There, stretched out across the floorboards, was a shadow. But it wasn't shaped like Elias. It was the shape of the mirror Elias, the multi-limbed, perfectly symmetrical nightmare. It was flat, black, and two-dimensional, but it was moving independently of Elias's body. The shadow raised a black, silhouetted hand and pointed toward the empty silver frame of the Chronos Mirror. "You took my world," the shadow whispered, its voice echoing from the wood grain. "So I took your place in the light. You are the shadow now, Elias. You are the thing that doesn't exist. And I'm just waiting for the sun to go down." Elias realized the horror of the trade. The matter exchange hadn't been stopped. It had been corrupted. He was physically present, but visually erased, while the entity was visually present as a shadow, waiting to fill Elias's empty reflection. Suddenly, the shadow entity lunged. It didn't strike Elias. It slid under his feet, and Elias felt a cold, paralyzing numbness climb up his spine. The shadow was trying to wear him. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the workshop. For Elias, this was a countdown to extinction. He was a physical man, but to the world of light, he was a void. He stood before a window, and the sunlight passed straight through his torso, as if he were made of air, leaving no shadow behind. But the entity, the thing that was now his shadow, was growing stronger. As the sun hit a lower angle, the shadow on the floor stretched and thickened. It was no longer just a flat shape. It began to pull at the physical world. Elias watched in horror as the shadow's black hand reached for a heavy iron wrench on the workbench. The shadow's hand touched the shadow of the wrench, and the physical tool was flung across the room, nearly taking Elias's head off. "I don't need a body to kill you, Elias," the shadow rasped from the floorboards. "I just need to touch the darkness you're hiding in." Elias realized the terrifying mechanics of his new existence. Because he had no reflection and cast no shadow, he was invisible to the entity's direct sight. But the entity could manipulate anything that did have a shadow. He ran for the door, but the shadow was faster. It slid across the floor, reaching the shadow of the doorframe. The shadow entity slammed its weight against the door's silhouette, and the physical door bolted shut with a violent thump, locking Elias inside. "You're a glitch, Elias," the shadow laughed. "And I am the patch." Elias stumbled back, realizing he was trapped in a room full of weapons for the shadow. Every stool, every lamp, every piece of art equipment cast a shadow that the entity could use as a limb. He needed to become completely invisible. He grabbed a gallon of white primer paint. If he couldn't cast a shadow, he needed to make the environment as bright and flat as possible to eliminate any shadows the entity could use. He began to splash the white paint everywhere: the floor, the walls, the furniture. As the workshop turned into a blinding, featureless white void, the shadow entity began to shrink. Without shadows to hide in or grab, its influence over the physical world weakened. It writhed on the floor, its many limbs becoming thin and spindly. "You're erasing the stage." The shadow hissed, its voice fading. But Elias was running out of time. The sun was almost gone. Once the sun disappeared, the entire world would become a shadow. The blue hour was approaching, and in the twilight, the entity would be omnipotent. Elias looked at his own hands. They were becoming translucent. He wasn't just losing his reflection, he was losing his density. He was fading out of the physical world entirely, turning into a phantom frequency. He needed to find the original silver frame. Even without the glass, the frame was the anchor. If he could fuse his fading physical form with the anchor, he might be able to pull his reflection back from whatever void it was trapped in. But as he reached for the frame, the sun dipped below the horizon. The room plunged into gray twilight. The shadows didn't just grow, they merged. The entire floor became a sea of black ink, and from that ink, the mirror Elias rose, not as a reflection and not as a shadow, but as a three-dimensional silhouette of pure darkness. The room was no longer a workshop. It was a sea of gray-black ink. In the twilight, the boundaries between objects disappeared. To Elias, who was already fading from the visual spectrum, the world looked like a low-resolution ghost of itself. But for the silhouette entity, the dark was a playground. It was no longer bound to the floor. It rose like a pillar of smoke, a three-dimensional void that was darker than the darkness around it. It had no eyes, yet it moved with predatory precision. "You are fading, Elias," the void whispered. The sound didn't come from a mouth. It was the sound of the air being displaced. "You are becoming a whisper. Let go. Give me the shell." Elias couldn't see the monster, but he could hear the floorboards groaning under its weightless pressure. He realized he was at a massive disadvantage. He was becoming a ghost, but he still had a physical heart that beat with fear. The monster could hear his pulse. He closed his eyes. "If I can't see him, he can't use my sight against me," Elias thought. He reached out with his hands, feeling the cold, painted walls. He remembered the layout of the workshop perfectly. It was the map of his life. He heard a soft whoosh to his left. He ducked. A heavy easel, thrown by the silhouette, shattered against the wall where his head had been a second ago. "Sound," Elias muttered. "It's all about the vibration." He grabbed a jar of metal ball bearings from a shelf. He scattered them across the floor. Clink. Roll. Stop. For a moment, there was silence. Then a bearing moved. Clack. Then another. Tink. The entity was stepping on them. Even though the monster was made of shadow, it still had to exert force on the physical world to move. Elias tracked the sound. The entity was circling him, moving toward the silver frame. "You want the anchor?" Elias shouted, his voice sounding thin and metallic. "You want to lock the door?" He lunged toward the sound of the rolling bearings. He collided with something that felt like freezing, wet velvet. It was the entity. The contact was like an electric shock of pure cold. Elias felt his remaining realness being drained into the silhouette. But Elias didn't pull away. He wrapped his fading arms around the void. "If I'm going into the frame," Elias hissed, "you're coming with me as a passenger, not the driver." He tackled the silhouette, and together, They tumbled toward the blackened silver frame. As they hit the threshold, the air didn't feel like air anymore. It felt like liquid mercury. The frame began to glow with a dying, phosphorescent light. The event horizon of the mirror was reacting to the presence of both the original and the copy hitting the anchor at the same time. They were stuck in the throat of the mirror, halfway between the world of light and the world of glass. Elias could see his apartment on one side and the infinite violet ruins of the mirror world on the other. Suddenly, Elias saw his own reflection again. It was trapped inside the silver frame, screaming without a voice. But it wasn't just one reflection, because the frame was glitching. It was showing every version of Elias that had ever looked into a mirror. The child Elias, the grieving Elias, the old Elias. The silhouette let out a screech of agony. The presence of so many truths was toxic to a perfect copy. The threshold of the silver frame was a sensory hurricane. Elias and the silhouette entity were suspended in a kaleidoscope of vibrating glass. On every side, hundreds of Elias reflections flickered like strobe lights. You see them, the silhouette shrieked, its dark form writhing as it tried to anchor itself to Elias's spine. They are all failures. The child who cried in the dark, the man who let his parents die alone, the restorer who hid from the world. They are weak, Elias. Let me delete them and make you whole. The entity began to infect the reflections. As the silhouette touched the image of the 6-year-old Elias, the boy's eyes turned into black pits of mercury. The memory of Elias's first art restoration began to warp. The beautiful painting in the reflection turned into a canvas of rotting flesh. The monster was performing a psychological override. It knew it couldn't win a physical fight in the between, so it was attacking Elias's history. If it could prove that Elias's life was nothing but a series of broken errors, Elias would lose the will to exist, and the perfect copy would take over by default. Look at yourself, the entity roared. You are a collection of scars. Why fight for a life that hurts? Elias felt the coldness spreading. He looked at the reflection of himself at 20 years old, a version of him full of hope, and watched as the image's skin began to turn into cold, gray marble. He felt his own heart slowing, his thoughts becoming rigid and mathematical. Because, Elias gasped, his voice vibrating against the liquid mercury of the void. The scars are the only things that aren't a reflection. He reached out and grabbed the hand of his youngest reflection, the crying child. The entity recoiled as if burned. The pain is the proof. Elias screamed, "You can't copy a scar, you monster. You can only copy the skin." Elias began to pull the broken reflections toward him. He didn't try to fix them. He didn't try to make them perfect. He embraced the grief, the fear, and the failures. As he merged with each shattered self, his body began to regain its density. He wasn't turning back into a smooth, clean man. He was becoming a mosaic of light and shadow. His skin began to look like Kintsugi, the Japanese art of fixing broken pottery with gold. The cracks in his identity were filling with a fierce, blinding light that the silhouette couldn't stand. "No," the entity cried, its many limbs dissolving into smoke. "This is chaos. This is asymmetry. You are destroying the balance." "I'm not destroying it," Elias said, his voice now a powerful harmony of all his past selves. "I'm inhabiting it." With a final, violent surge of will, Elias pulled the last reflection, the old man Elias he had yet to become, into his chest. The explosion of truth was too much for the frame. The black and silver began to melt, and the between started to collapse. The silhouette entity was being squeezed out, like air from a balloon, pushed back toward the infinite violet ruins of the mirror world. "You'll never be pure," the entity hissed as it vanished. "I know," Elias whispered. The explosion of light was silent, a conceptual detonation that reset the physics of the room. Elias felt himself being hurled backward, landing hard against the cold, paint-stained floorboards of his workshop. The morning sun was cresting the horizon, sending a single, golden spear of light through the window. It hit the spot where the Chronos Mirror had stood. The silver frame was gone, melted into a pool of dull, inert lead on the floor. Elias lay there for a long time, listening to the birds outside and the distant hum of the city. He looked at his hands. The silvery sheen was gone. His skin was pale, mapped with the familiar lines of his life, but there was something different. When he moved, there was a faint, golden shimmer in his scars, the mark of the Kintsugi Man. He stood up, his joints aching with a wonderful, human heaviness. He walked to the bathroom. This was the true test. He stood before the mirror. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the empty wall. Elias felt a cold spike of dread. But then, slowly, a shape flickered into existence. It was him, Elias Thorne. But his reflection wasn't a slave to his movements. The mirror Elias was standing there, arms crossed, watching him with a look of mutual respect. Elias raised his right hand. The reflection waited a second, then raised its left hand, the way a natural mirror should. The symmetry was back, but the agreement had changed. The mirror was no longer a window for a predator. It was a partner in his existence. "We're both still here," Elias whispered. His reflection nodded once, a solemn, independent gesture, and then synced back into perfect, ordinary movement. Later that afternoon, Elias began to clean up the wreckage of the workshop. He picked up the lead remains of the frame to throw them away. But as he moved the heavy metal, he saw a small, hidden compartment in the floorboards that the frame had been covering. Inside was a leather-bound journal belonging to Archibald Vane, the clockmaker. Elias opened it to the last page. The handwriting was frantic, the ink smeared with what looked like liquid mercury. "I have succeeded in the exchange. My reflection is now the one who ages, the one who suffers, the one who dies. I have stepped into the obsidian deep to live forever in the violet light of perfection. If you find this, do not mourn me. I'm finally flawless." Elias looked at the empty space where the mirror had been. He thought of the infinite violet ruins, the air that tasted of old coins, and the terrifying cold perfection he had escaped. Archibald Vane hadn't been a victim. He had been the architect of his own hollow eternity. He was still in there, somewhere a flawless ghost in a world with no heart. Elias walked to the window and looked out at the street. It was raining now. The puddles on the sidewalk reflected the gray sky, the dirty buildings, and the passing cars. It was messy. It was distorted. It was beautiful. He reached out and touched the glass of the window. He saw his reflection, and for a brief moment, the mirror Elias winked at him. Elias smiled back, a real, asymmetrical human smile. He picked up his brushes and began to work. He didn't need to restore old masterpieces anymore. He was ready to paint something new, something with shadows,